All right, so today's lesson is all about basically weed and pest management and the UC IPM kind of strategy for dealing with weeds and pests. And so we're gonna begin the class. There we go. Thank you everybody who submitted your homework. I did read all of them since about 5 minutes ago. So if you sent it just in the last 5 minutes, I might not have gotten to it yet. Big takeaway from me from what I was reading was a lot of a few missed opportunities for the lawn conversion rebate. There were a few scenarios where people stated that the lawn might have already been dead, and so that was the issue with not being able to do a lawn rebate on a particular client's property. Other people, the most excitement or interest on rebates seem to be for rain barrels and cisterns, and most opportunity there, as well as the soil sensors and some of the sprinkler head changes. So that was really great to see all of you guys analyzing properties, whether it's your own property or the property of a client. It was really kind of nice, and the cost savings. Some of you went into the marked exactly how much you could get back in a rebate, some to the tune of more than $3,000, which is pretty great depending on what you were getting, and others responded in a little bit more general sense and didn't do the actual cost calculations, and that's okay. Ultimately, if it was something that you're going to be sharing with a client, you'll want to give them a money amount and let them know how much they would receive back as a rebate for getting, say, the upgraded low volume sprinkler nozzle or sprinkler head, or getting the cistern or getting the rain barrel. So that's just something to keep in mind. If anybody has any comments regarding the homework, feel free to put them in the chat. But it was pretty straightforward. It was one of the less kind of complicated ones. So if I don't see anything in the chat, I will assume we all kind of just understood it. And we can move on. All right, not seeing anything, so let's move on. So this is going to be a pretty big lesson. I'm saying big in the sense that there's a lot of content similar to the second lesson of this series, which was the plant ID. There's going to be a lot of slides in this one. And some of it might be a little bit of, pest ID, but on the whole, it's going to be kind of, I want to make sure there's a big picture kind of takeaway that isn't necessarily that you need to know every single pest and every single treatment of a pest, but rather to think of the garden a little bit more holistically, or the landscape a little more holistically, and kind of work with rather than against Mother Nature. So being able to identify some weedy plants would be something that we might be able to accomplish today. Managing weeds by knowing their life cycle and cultural conditions and different kinds of strategies for managing weeds, and then conditions and pests that are most commonly seen in a native plant garden, and using IPM techniques successfully, and whether some of those techniques might be to do less rather than more, depending on the situation, and being able to use the IPM website and kind of diagnostic tools that they have on their website so that you can figure out what might be the issue. So somebody said the audio, meaning my voice, is coming in a little spotty. Does anyone else have that concern, or is that potentially on Maggie's end and not on my end? Can people put in the chat whether or not they're hearing me clearly? And I will continue to speak so you can use that as an example. So Jess said it's good. George said the voice, I'm coming in good. So far, most people seem to be saying that they're able to hear. So no problem. If you need to leave and come back to see if it fixes itself, please do. We'll just readmit you. So anytime you have some technical issue or you need to bump off or come back, that's entirely okay. So don't worry about that. We won't count you absent, don't worry. All right. All righty. So weeds and weeding. One thing to keep in mind is don't assume things are weeds. If you have an owner, the owner of a property who has some knowledge over their garden and or potentially was the one who installed the garden, you want to make sure that you've completely understood what they planted, what they want there, and what they don't want there. So sometimes the idea of what a weed is just a plant out of place. That's kind of what we call a weed. So it could be potentially a native plant growing in the middle of a pathway. We would say, oh, that's a weed, because we don't want it there. That's a little bit broad. For me, I do like to think of weeds being things that might be, non-native species that are unwanted versus a native species that's just in the wrong place. But that's up to you and your interpretation. But the idea of things that you might need to remove or relocate or anything like that, then we can kind of put it under that umbrella of a weed. But you don't know necessarily what the client wants there and doesn't. So getting that kind of feedback is important. But if they don't have any knowledge of weeds versus native plants or any of that, then you're going to be that expert who makes those decisions. And so depending on the garden itself, over time, you'll find that weeds will naturally kind of be less and less of an issue for a number of reasons. One being that the irrigation eventually will get peeled back so far that many of our kind of competitive weeds don't have a really favorable environment anymore. And the other is that the plants that you have potentially planted, and as the plants get more mature and they cover more space, they actually push out and kind of crowd out some of those more aggressive weeds. So it's not the case for all of them, but you'll find your weeding becomes less and less over time. So there are two factors that determine whether the weeds will win. High propagule pressure and high seed mass. They're kind of a little bit synonymous. High propagule pressure, lots of weeds that might be spreading by, potentially rhizomes, potentially by seed, potentially by rooting in other ways. So we have a lot of pressure from the weed itself as far as, kind of volume, and then high seed mass as well. So if you have particular seeds, particular weeds that have an abundance of seeds and they're really viable seeds, you're going to get a lot of weeds coming up after that. So it kind of depends on just the volume of weeds, and then of the weeds, how much seed they produce and how viable that seed is. And so to be able to understand your weeds and know where they come from and what they're doing and how they move and propagate themselves in the landscape is going to be an important strategy for you. For instance, the way that you tackle a perennial weed or a weed that maybe creeps from underground stems called rhizomes that looks like underground roots and then they pop up in other places, that's going to be a different strategy of management than an annual grass that lives for one season, and it's the way that it reproduces itself is by just pumping as many seeds out into the world as possible before it dies off. So your strategy for that annual will be make sure it doesn't flower and set seed. Your strategy for the perennial might include not flowering and setting seed, but it'll also have to include some form of killing the plant at the root zone. And that's a much more challenging situation. So if you have annual weeds, you're actually in a much more favorable situation. It's a much more doable task than perennial weeds or weeds that have rhizomes or weeds that have little bulbs that stay in the ground. Even when you pull the weed out, it has these little kind of bulbs that hang around in the soil that just perpetuate the plant indefinitely. So knowing what you have is important. So different techniques to tackle this issue. Mechanical doesn't mean you use a machine. It literally just means like physical removal. Pulling weeds, especially with your hand or with a tool, is considered a mechanical removal. As it was mentioned in one of the other classes, and I don't remember which one, it was one of the earlier ones, we talked about the preference for non-disturbance of soil. Might have been the soil class actually. Pulling weeds brings up a lot of dirt and actually disturbs kind of the soil underground. And so if you are doing it in a pretty minimal way with just your hand and the roots aren't necessarily pulling up whole clumps of soil with it, I think mechanical removal, just pulling the weeds, is fine. But if it's pulling up huge chunks of soil, or if you're using a tool like one of those little trowels or forks that disturbs the soil, not only is that not favorable for the health of the soil, but you're actually fluffing up the seed bed for more seeds to come up, more weed seeds to come up. So weeds and seeds are dormant in the seed bank, kind of in the soil, and they only can germinate when they reach a certain level of surface to be able to get the water and the sunlight. So if they're buried really deep, you're fine. But if they're kind of closer to the surface, then they're really going to germinate. They really favor disturbed soil conditions. And most of our native plants favor rested soil that's not been highly disturbed. There are some that are fine in disturbed zones. But generally speaking, disturbance favors weeds almost always. Weeds thrive on that kind of disturbance. So the less you disturb the soil, the better long-term for seed kind of weed management. And sometimes somebody made a comment, you sometimes don't know how big the roots are. And so in that scenario, if you're just wanting to test with one, see how much soil disturbance was created by pulling the one, and then make a judgment call after that. If you determine, hey, this is too much soil disturbance, then that might be a scenario where you cut the plant at the base. Sometimes you can get either a hula hoe or one of those other kind of, they're these really cool, like Japanese small, like sickle weeders. They cut it right at the soil line. Sometimes it disturbs a little bit of the top of the soil, but it's not as disruptive as sometimes pulling up a huge kind of clump of soil with the root system. So you might consider a tactic where you cut either right above or right below the soil line in lieu of pulling the whole system out. So cultural is mostly about mulching. So doing the kind of garden strategy or conditions whereby the weeds are suppressed. So generally speaking, your mulch does an amazing job at suppressing weeds. The point of the mulch or the reason why it suppresses the weed growth is because it reduces the amount of sunlight that the little seedling can have access to. And so the seedling starts to grow and then it gets really a little tendrily, and then if it still can't penetrate the mulch barrier, it just dies from lack of sunlight. If it can penetrate the mulch barrier, it's usually gotten this long, weakened kind of growth within the mulch that makes it quite easy to pull it out. And so if it's stretched itself just to try to reach for the sun, it's got this like long, thinner, weaker kind of structure. And so even weeding through mulch tends to be easier than weeding not through mulch. And so you want to make sure that you've pulled back the mulch from the stems of the plants that you've planted, however, because you don't want the mulch again. The mulch, as it decomposes, the fungal activity that's going to happen there, it's a decomposition process. You don't want that happening on a living plant. You want to just make sure there's a little bit of breathing space. And because again, mildews, molds, all those decomposers, it's all healthy stuff, but ultimately it's not healthy on a living plant. You want it to have that activity only on the dead material. And so again, that activity will eventually break down that mulch into something the plants can use. All right, so solarization. I'm just going to periodically check the chat in case somebody says anything relevant to the actual slides, and then we can comment after that. But soil solarization, this is a method. If you've ever driven by farms, certain farmland, sometimes you'll see this like white plastic sheet, or it's clear, but it looks white from the road, clear plastic sheeting along the farm rows. They do it a lot for like strawberries and such. So sometimes you'll see it where it's actually like protecting them, but in this case, they're actually solarizing the soil prior to a new planting. And the reason for that is that what the solarization does, being a clear plastic, it still allows the sun to come through. But being that it's plastic, it cooks the soil underneath essentially. And so weed seeds, fungal pathogens, also beneficials. So it kind of is indiscriminate. The surface of the soil gets kind of cooked or sterilized. And then when you release it or you remove it after several weeks to months, in the hottest time of the year is when you want to do it, you can plant almost anything there and it won't have any weeds. And so this image that you're seeing in the slide was our very successful attempt at Theodore Payne when I was working there. I'm actually this person here behind this person in the blue. I'm here. That's me. So we solarized these wide strips on Wildflower Hill, which is a little hillside at the Theodore Payne property. And this hillside became part of the Wildflowering LA kind of project that, I don't know if you guys are familiar, they did this Wildflowering LA project where they did, Theodore Payne distributed these wildflower seeds for various spots throughout Los Angeles. It could have been somebody's front yard, a vacant lot, etc. And they kind of made it this like rotating tour where you can go around and you can see all these wildflower kind of super blooms in LA, basically. And so we used this hillside for the Wildflowering LA kind of exhibit at Theodore Payne. And the wildflowers that grew on this hillside was solid wildflowers, and it had never been that before. It was always weeds, grassy, annual European grasses was pretty much the dominant feature there. And so this year it was all wildflowers. It was like all Clarkias and Globigilias and I forgot what else there was. It was just like poppies. It was this incredible wildflower show because the weed seeds in the soil had all been killed off. And so it was very successful. The next year they didn't solarize. And so it was half and half. It was like wildflowers and weeds. And then the following year is like all weeds and then just a few wildflowers. So it's something that you have to potentially keep doing over and over. But if you wanted to get something kind of get that initial kill done, this is a non-toxic, non-chemical way to do it just with the sun's rays and heat alone. So hold on, I'm gonna check the chat real quick. Yeah, the solarization is something that you need to do during the hottest time of the year. So in the middle of spring and summer or maybe that late summer, fall is when you want to do it, and it needs to be done for several consecutive weeks. Somebody noted that he avoids solarization because of the plastic waste, and that's a good thing to point out. And he wonders if glass panels resting on wood would work in the same way. And I don't know if glass would retain the heat underneath as well as plastic will, unfortunately. But I totally get the reason to want to avoid it. You can also do the sheet mulching, but that's not something where you could have done wildflowers on top of that. Yeah, somebody asked if you can do, yeah, you can use a weed eater to tackle weeds, certainly. It depends on what kind of weed situation you're doing. If you're like managing a large amount of parkland or something like that, or a really large property, you can do the weed whackers and make sure you just get the plant before it sets seed. That's the really key thing. So you sometimes have to do it more than once in that scenario. So cardboard is definitely an option. You can do the cardboard with the mulch on top, and it would smother in the same way that mulch smothers by lack of access to light. It would smother and starve the weeds of light. So that's called sheet mulching. Sometimes people use newspapers and mulch or cardboard and mulch. So that's another potential option. I don't know if there's a slide for that. There is not. So chemical is a last resort. So glyphosate is kind of a big, what is the term? controversial, there we go, controversial product because of the company that it's created it. However, the scenario where you've done every single potential benign method and the weeds are still there, you might find that using some kind of chemical herbicide is kind of your last resort option. I wouldn't say it's like you should never, ever, 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 ever do it. There are some, scenarios where, like I said, you've gone through the mechanical method, you've gone through cultural, you've gone through solarization, you've gone through everything, and you've done everything except there's just one patch of something that will not leave. That's when you could do chemical. It's not ideal. It's not first choice. The biggest issues is when people think that's the first option, or that's the lazy option, or that's the fill in the blank option. It should be 100% the last option. Somebody also mentioned in the chat, don't forget our chicken friends. I will add to that and say your goat friends. Depending again on your scenario, they do have goat brush clearance. You can hire a team of goats to eat the weeds. They will eat everything though, so that's something to keep in mind. Both chickens and the goats will eat everything as long as they can reach it. But chickens are really actually quite excellent at removing anything living from like 4 feet and under. We used to have chickens. One of the reasons why I got into native plant gardening was because of the aftermath of what my backyard looked like after having 8 chickens for many years. Basically everything 4 feet and under was completely bare. We only had trees. And so birds would nest in the trees, and then during the natural fledgling kind of period where the baby birds come out of the nest, but they can't fly yet, they're just hopping on the ground. Normally they'd have places to hide and escape predators, but because our chickens denuded the whole yard of everything green and everything alive, the birds would hop around and my dogs kept killing them. And so it was traumatic. Like, it happened so many times that I realized that I had to do something about making my yard more a haven for wildlife that actually supported the whole life cycle of the animals and not just one life cycle. And so that was kind of my introduction into the native plant gardening world, and creating habitat gardens was from too many unfortunate deaths of young fledgling birds. So I don't know why I got into that. Oh, chickens, right. So chickens will eat everything, and they're fantastic, but just keep in mind they will eat like every single thing. So if you can like put them in a little wagon and like put them in a thing and like move them around over the weeds, and then they can only eat the weeds and then move them to another section, then that would be very successful. Are there indigenous weeds that don't you need hazmat gear to protect yourself from herbicide? It depends on how much you're using. If you're using it like in a backpack and it's that quantity, then you want to be protected. But if you're just using it, again, very small localized application, you don't need hazmat gear that I know of. What you want to do is make sure you're wearing gloves. And if it's something where it's a windy day, do not use it. You don't want it spraying onto other plants. So the way that like glyphosate, for instance, works is you actually spray it on the leaves, it takes it in from the leaves, and then it kills the root system underground. And so if there's a little bit of like misting and it mists onto your native plants, you can really harm your native plants. The thing to do if you have, say you have Bermuda grass and it's coming up through your plants, and so you have your native plant, you have your Bermuda grass, and you want the Bermuda grass to die, but you don't want your native plant to die. What you can do is wear a glove. You can spray the Roundup or whatever it is on your hand, on your gloved hand, and you can rub the weeds with that gloved hand so that you're not spraying it onto the whole plant. So that's a very kind of localized approach where you're not getting like, there's no collateral damage. Somebody also asked if there's indigenous weeds that fight invasive weeds. So there's such a thing as an indigenous weed or a weedy plant that's indigenous. There are some indigenous plants that are really widespread. You'll see them like all across North America, and we would maybe categorize that as a weed. So for instance, like what is it, Erigeron glaucus, or horseweed or something like that, really tall, really weedy. We would pull that in any scenario saying that's a weed, but technically it's indigenous, but it's also indigenous to like a million other places. So yeah, there are some weeds, but the idea that there's a native plant that you want in your garden that is as aggressive as the weeds that you don't want, sometimes you can get a grass. Purple 3-on is a good example of a pretty weed, like a very readily propagating grass. But otherwise, sometimes planting your native plants more closely so that they fill in faster and cover ground faster is a strategy that you can use. Robert says that he used a goat team at San Manuel to control the weeds. Yeah, and goats are pretty very cool. There are some weeds that animals can't eat. Spurge is toxic in general. Some animals are fine with it. But yes, technically, yeah, there are things. I feel like goats can probably eat poison and they'd be fine. They have like somehow these cast iron stomachs. Rubber gloves. Yes, you want to wear rubber gloves in the context of, you mean non-nitrile? Is that what you mean, Charles? Like thick.
I basically just meant as opposed to leather gloves or something.
Oh yes. Yeah, something that will repel. You don't want anything that's going to absorb the chemicals. So do not wear your regular garden gloves. In this context, you want to wear like a nitrile glove or rubber glove, some kind of a repellent glove. In Central Valley, there's valley fever due to the herbicide sprayed in the fields. Any widespread use of herbicide is dangerous. So I will say, in the context of what we're talking about you're doing every single method that isn't herbicide, and really, if you, as a last resort, will use an herbicide in a very localized, very specific, very minimal way. So that if you use it at all. So yes, in the context where the herbicides have become just the go-to response to weeds instead of any other method, you're going to see all sorts of issues. Bermuda grass is that kind of perennial creeps on the ground, spreads by rhizomes, has rhizomes throughout the soil and pops up all the time. Laurel sumac spreads like crazy in my yard. Laurel sumac is one of those wonderful native shrubs that doesn't require any help in order to be really abundant. That's what I like about it. When somebody said, are there any native plants that can compete with weeds? I would say laurel sumac, being both a really good fire follower, so really adaptive to coming back after fire, seeds really easily, and thrives in a ton of harsh conditions. You'll see it on freeways all the time. It's one of the only things sometimes in repeatedly burned areas. So that's a plant that's a highly successful plant that some people overlook for being so successful, and they think that it's like maybe weedy. So obviously remove it in any scenario where you don't want a really big shrub. So that could be considered like, oh yeah, that's a weed because we don't want it in this context. But it has immense value in all the other ways. All right. Okay. So moving on. Hey, native plants can be weedy. So again, depends on what you want in the garden. I personally would never argue with this incredible fuchsia border. Like, I'm happy if a native plant is weedy, and I feel in most, not every single scenario, but in most contexts, I'm feeling very proud if a native plant can not only thrive in a space, but kind of take over and make it harder for other things to kind of infiltrate and take over. So I think it's really cool that the kind of rhizome spreading plants like Matilaha poppy, like the fuchsias, can kind of really colonize a space. One of the ones that does this, but you also have to think about your space. You have to think about, if you have a small garden, you might not want one that does that. So if you have a tiny garden, your whole garden is going to end up with Matilaha poppies, which is really beautiful, but then you might not have space for other things. If you do the chaparral mallow or the casitas cultivar of the chaparral mallow, those spread by rhizomes and they start to take over spaces. So if you have a small space, I wouldn't pick that plant. Not because I would say like, oh, it's a weed, but because it's just gonna outgrow the size of the space that you have. And so just think about that. Not so much that it's a weed or it's bad, but just make sure that you are understanding the potential for it to spread and kind of like colonize the space. Buckwheats, so Eriogonum species, are free seeders. So you'll often see little seedlings, which is beautiful and a wonderful thing. In the wild, that's what they're doing. And that's what, you know, it's really, really important to have that natural seedling recruitment. And so in the scenario where it's in a client's yard or your yard, you might consider transplanting that into a location that you do want. So that's kind of like little treasure, or giving it out to your neighbors. So I wouldn't say that that's all like, oh, we have to pull every single one. How annoying that this thing is reproducing in my yard. It's a beautiful thing. And you do want it to do that because that means that it's a healthy, thriving system. One of the things to consider is, for me, I always want to design a garden that if humans just all kind of like drop dead overnight, or if you went on vacation for a year and didn't touch your yard, not watered it, not weeded, not anything, like how much of your native garden would be alive after you come back after a year? That's what I want to think about. And not only that, like what if you did that for 5 years or 10 years? Is it reproducing on its own? Is it sustaining itself? Is it adapted enough to the exact climate where you're at that it's going to be self-perpetuating? And so that's what I kind of want to make sure to create in any kind of garden, is not something that's always on life support and not something that's never going to reproduce on its own and never going to replace old plants with new seedlings. So think about kind of just that continuity of the kind of ecological value of the space, where it's not going to be always dependent on you, and make sure that you're kind of designing your space to be able to serve that function. All right. Hashtag garden goals. Thank you, Raul. That was good. All right. So integrated pest management principles as it relates to native plants. So it's an ecosystem-based strategy, focuses on long-term prevention. When it does include chemical control, the idea is that you're using a very specific approach for a very specific situation, and you're not just broadly, you know, just trying to kill off everything, and in the meantime you have all this collateral damage of insects or things that weren't the targets getting harmed. So there's the UCIPM website is a really great guide to the least toxic treatments for home and garden pests. But one thing I will say, and we'll probably say it throughout the class, is that my understanding of pest management is a little bit more less is more. And that you will find that with a native garden, the goal, again, hashtag garden goal, is that your garden is a habitat for all kinds of insects and their natural predators, and other animals and their natural predators, and other animals and their natural predators, so that the whole cycle of life and the food web is happening in your space. So that includes control of pests by their natural predators. Sometimes you get animals that don't have a natural predator, but many of them do. And so you'll find that actually not doing anything and backing off is often a better strategy than trying to figure out exactly what you should do. What chemical should I spray? What you know, or even if it's soapy water, should I spray soapy water on my aphids? Most of the time, just wait it out is a really good strategy. So that's what we talk about, an action level or a threshold. So one thing you need to think about is, what is the level of damage that you're willing to tolerate in order to allow that process to kind of happen before you personally decide you need to take action. And so it's different. Sometimes if it's something that's in really high public eye and very public facing with a lot of visibility, maybe your threshold's really low, and your action levels is pretty early in the process. I'm personally not in that camp. My threshold is quite high, and the action level, I would have to think the plant is legitimately in danger of death before I do something about it. And even then, sometimes I will allow a plant to die and then do a better job potentially of where I put the plant, or maybe try a different species, etc., depending on the scenario. So you have to think about what your that threshold is and when you're going to act. And I recommend waiting stuff out more so than action. So for instance, with aphids, and this is for native gardens, if you go from a lawn garden to a native garden, you often get a lot of insect issues, and not in a bad sense necessarily, but like a lot of aphids or a lot of new things that you weren't dealing with in the first 2 years. And the reason for that is that you've all of a sudden provided this banquet of really good native plants that the wildlife actually can subsist on. That includes some pests. And it takes a little while for the natural pest predators to catch on and find it, and find that there's an actual really great buffet of aphids or fill in the blank pest in the yard. But once they do, they start to make that a regular place that they visit. They literally know that, like, this is where the buffet is at 4416 such and such street. There's all these aphids. And so you're going to get your ladybugs visiting that site. You're going to get your lacewings visiting that site. You're going to get your syrphid flies going there. You're going to get your parasitic wasps going there. And so I just named a bunch of, aphid eaters. Either they eat the aphids or their larvae eat the aphids, or they lay eggs inside the aphid bodies, which is what the parasitic wasps do, which is so cool. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like in a bit. And so you get all these natural enemies to these pests because you didn't take away their food. If you saw a bunch of aphids on a plant, you said, oh, I better spray that. You're going to do one of two things. You're either going to take away the food so the natural predators never catch on. They don't know that there's a banquet there for them. Or you're going to potentially kill the beneficials and the pests, because the beneficials will see it. They will lay eggs on the plant that's going to have all this food for their babies. They're going to lay the eggs. The little larva is going to come out. They're going to start eating the aphids, and then you're going to spray it with neem oil and kill everybody. And so waiting is really the best strategy, because you want to create a system that's self-managing. You do not want to create a system that is constantly dependent on you. I mean that about irrigation. I mean that about pest management. I mean that about just the whole thing about this kind of style of landscape management and gardening and design, is that you want this to be able to thrive without you, so that you can do touch-ups, you can enjoy it, you can actually just participate and observe it without having to have it be this like weirdly codependent relationship. And so that's what you're setting up. That's how you're setting up the training of the irrigation for that establishment, watering to train them to be really deep rooted. And that's how you're doing this kind of like a little bit more hands-off pest management strategy, so that you can invite all of that natural world and natural predators to kind of take care of the problem for you. All right. So the aphids on the milkweed, somebody asked how do you get rid of aphids on milkweed? Aphids are just a natural part of milkweed. I wouldn't get rid of them. I would just leave them. They don't kill the plant. They're just ugly. And that's the only problem with those aphids. Ladybugs will naturally come to those aphids and all sorts of other aphids as well. And so I would just leave them alone. Alternatively, if you find that they've covered the whole plant and you're not even able to, you think that the plant is legitimately suffering, just crush them with your fingers up and down the stem. Just manually crush them and spray the stems with water. But be aware, again, you will see lacewing eggs. They're like little filaments. There's like a little egg on the filament that's stuck on the underside of a leaf. You'll see them attached to aphids. You will see the ladybugs and their larvae on aphids, on the milkweed. So I wouldn't do anything about it at all. You don't need to get rid of aphids almost always. Not every single time, but like it is one of the easiest things to be taken care of by other insects. Buying ladybugs. I'm not a fan of buying ladybugs. I think you should just have the food and the ladybugs will come. Oftentimes you buy the ladybugs and then you put them in your yard and then they just take off and they don't even stay in your yard. And sometimes they're not indigenous species of ladybugs. They're from Asia, and so I don't think that that's necessary. I think you just need to have a really robust garden that attracts lots of life. That's it. You're meaning to attract so many different kinds of forms of life, and the natural way will just kind of start happening. That kind of attraction will bring everything that you need for the most part. Yeah, they just fly away, George said. All right, great. Let's move on. So identifying the cause of health problems or pest problems. Environmental causes can cause disease issues and pathogens and pests and things like that. So light weather, extraordinary events, obviously high stressors, similar to the way human health is affected by some of these things. Your plants can be affected by all of these things. And so, the bigger picture environment is a big piece of it. Cultural causes, I would say, that is mostly you. So garden culture is going to be the way that you interact with the garden, the use of the garden and abuse, the on-site and off-site issues that might come up, and then overwatering probably as one of the biggest issues in native plant horticulture as far as causing disease and or other issues. So pests, obviously, vertebrate and invertebrate. By invertebrate, obviously we mean insects and such. Vertebrate, like your gophers, your rabbits, deer, and such. Diseases, they're generally viral, bacterial, or fungal. There's, I don't know why it just says symptoms versus diseases, but keep in mind that you need to, there's a really cool diagnostic kind of tool so that you can monitor symptoms. And so it's really important that you need to know there are some symptoms that are same throughout different kinds of diseases and also just different kinds of cultural issues that might come up. So you might have a symptom of overwatering where the leaves turn yellow, but that could be so many other potential diseases as well. And so you want to keep in mind that you're going to have a varied kind of palette of options to choose from based on the various symptoms that you record and you say that your plant is having. And so just keep that in mind, that symptoms and diseases are sometimes there's sometimes overlap and there's sometimes double up. So how do things get diseased? How does a pathogen actually take over a plant or a situation? First of all, you have to have a susceptible host. So for instance, my tortoises are not going to get COVID if I cough in their face and if I had COVID. I mean, I'm assuming lizards or, reptiles don't get COVID. So let me pretend that reptiles don't get COVID. And if I had COVID and I coughed in my tortoise's face, it wouldn't get sick. Why? Because it's not a susceptible host to that particular disease. But if I did that to my dog or a mammal or some other, COVID sensitive animal, that potential is there. And so you have to have the host that is susceptible to that particular disease. And that's the same for plants as well. Plants have diseases they're susceptible to and diseases they're immune to. You have to have a favorable environment for that particular pathogen. So even if there's a host, but the environment is unfavorable, you're not going to get disease. Okay, so, and then the third, you actually have to have the pathogen there. So that sounds very
Perfect storm.
Oh, yeah. All right, so you have to have the pathogen itself there. And so if the pathogen is not there, but you have the susceptible host and a favorable environment, you're not going to get disease. If you have a susceptible host and a pathogen, but the environment's not favorable, you're not going to get disease. And likewise, if you have a favorable environment with a pathogen, but there's no susceptible host, you're not going to get disease. So you have to have this kind of like trifecta of conditions in order to get this thing that we call disease in the plant. And so by eliminating one or the other, either by the exclusion of the pathogen by some means, the exclusion of the host by some means, meaning like plant selection, and the exclusion of the environment that creates that scenario, you can manage disease much better in the garden. And so to kind of describe and diagnose the plant health problem, you can describe obviously the whole plant, the main branch or stems, what is affecting them, the foliage means the leaves, flowers, sometimes a disease might stunt or deform or eat flowers, or by disease I mean also a pest in that scenario. And then fruit, the fruit might have some deformity or blight or some kind of disfiguration, and so you need to be able to start describing what might be happening to your plants to kind of narrow down what is the actual issue, because sometimes something will be a disease, sometimes it will be a pest, and they will look kind of similar. That's an owl. My gosh. Okay, there's an owl for you. IPM solutions. So what are some of the solutions to dealing with these issues? There's biological control. So that's what we talk about, natural enemies. That's what we refer to as like the ladybugs, the lacewings, the parasitic wasps and such. So there's biological control. You're using the natural enemies or competitors to control pests and their damage. In the case of agriculture, in the case of pretty widespread, really significant and frightening pest issues like shot hole borer and all of that. I think it's UCANR, they were doing a test to see if there was another beetle that would predate on the shot hole borer. And it's like years long of a test that you have to do to see that, number one, they will eat or hurt the shot hole borer. Number two, that they won't eat other things or kill other things that are not the shot hole borer. And so that's they're testing for some form of biological control for this invasive beetle. But in the case of what you guys are doing, you're going to be able to do that just by watching and waiting for the natural kind of enemies of these pests to come to the buffet of your yard anyway. So you don't need to worry about going out of your way to find a biological control, but people who do like large scale nurseries, large scale farming operations, etc., they might actually purchase, maybe either another kind of insect or another kind of biological control for spider mites, for such and such. So that because they're doing something on such a large scale that it makes sense for them. But in your case, I wouldn't even go in that direction. I would just let the natural management happen. So cultural controls are practices that reduce pest establishment, reproduction, dispersal, and survival. So things that you would do in your garden, for instance, I have not seen a slug or a snail in my yard for more than 15 years. Not a single one, not one. And that's just because I have a dry garden. I don't, aside from the natural rainfall and very minimal supplemental water, it's largely a drier environment. So slugs and snails that would normally eat my plants don't even visit my space. And so that's a cultural control. That's just my garden culture of not irrigating excessively creates that environment that is unfavorable to that particular pest. So you can think in those kinds of terms. In general, lower irrigation reduces your pest load a lot, just naturally. Pests really thrive in really moister environments. But some of this might include mulching. It might include using a certain type of mulch over a different mulch. Keep in mind that there are some mulches that are slightly repellent to insects, but that might include beneficials as well. Like cedar mulch can be a bit like, not insecticidal at all, and not to that level, but a little bit repellent. And so, you know, maybe they might discourage your beneficial insects from coming too. So just think about those kinds of things. So mechanical and physical controls will kill pests directly, block them out, or make the environment unsuitable for it. So the way that I think of that is fencing, caging, gopher cages, either on top or on the bottom, gopher baskets, actual traps, so cinch traps or those snap traps that kill rats, for instance, is considered a mechanical or physical control to reduce the pest. But largely it's like barriers, those kinds of things. So actual physical barriers that keep your plants protected from some kind of a pest or an animal. And then there's chemical control. And so this is again where the UCIPM recommendations are very targeted and very specific. So with the IPM, you'll use the most selective pesticide that will do the job and be the safest for the other organisms, for the air, soil, and water quality. So again, if it ever gets down to you're going to be using a chemical, and again, remember that this UCIPM website and this management technique is utilized by like huge farms and things like that. So it makes it's a little more relevant to those scales of operation versus your backyard, but there is a lot of resources obviously for the kind of the home garden environment. But the premise behind the chemical control is that you're using, again, something very targeted. It's not a generalized killer of something where, you know, spraying it will create so much collateral kind of damage and kill all sorts of other insects or beneficial insects or fungi or anything like that. And so that's, again, another kind of last resort scenario, but it's done in a way that's much more thoughtful than your typical kind of garden store variety pest control. Yes, so somebody, Charles, is making a very good comment with regards to, I will say mechanical or physical control is actual physically either cinch traps or harming them. With poisons, that would maybe be considered a chemical control, and that would not fall into UCIPM that I'm aware of. I think that those rat poisons or rodenticides, depending on the kind that you use, and some of the most common ones create this second generation poisoning effect, whereby the rat that was ingesting the poison gets eaten by another animal, either because it's sick and it's weak and it's easy prey for bobcats, for owls, for hawks, for even for mountain lions and such, and coyotes. It goes up the food chain. That poison gets taken up the food chain. And so these other animals that are the natural predators of these rats or other rodents that are being killed by the poisons, they start dying. They get sick. They're getting mange and all sorts of other diseases. And so then they die. And then the rats, they have no problem reproducing. They're so reproductively just abundant that they make up their numbers so quickly. But the owls, these slower reproducing predator animals, they are falling farther and farther behind. And so your natural predator population is dwindling while your rat and pest population is increasing. And so you have this opposite effect of what you were going for. And so I highly recommend you never use poison whatsoever, even the ones that don't have that kind of second generation effect. I don't think it's worth it at all to use poison. It's much more humane. Oops, sorry. I don't know if you can still see me. There we go. My screen went black for a second. Everyone can see me? We're all good? Okay, thank you, Emily. I needed that thumbs up. Okay, so it's much more humane It sounds horrible. It's much more humane to snap a rat, snap its neck in a cinch trap, or break its spine in a cinch trap. Big picture, ecologically speaking, that is a much more humane option than poison, which has a high risk of causing further damage down the food chain or up the food chain. And so if that's the route that you need to go, that's the route you go. If you can reduce, again, back to cultural controls, if you can reduce the ability for that pest to reproduce and do its thing, that would be even more humane than having to resort to physically killing something. So for instance, if your rats are attracted to your compost pile, like they were at my house because they chewed through the compost and they were reproducing based on all the kitchen scraps I had, it's better to remove your compost bin, get a new one that is completely sealed, and take away their food source. So that is a better first step than I'm going to kill all these rats that I have inadvertently been feeding for years. And so think about what kind of cultural changes you can do before obviously having to resort to, actual lethal means. George said, like a question, would you like to kill a rat with your hands or poison the entire food chain? I'd rather kill a rat with a trap than my hands than poison the food chain. But if I had to kill a rat with my hands or poison the food chain, I would do it with my hands. I don't think I would enjoy it in any way at all. But that was a very funny question. All right, so pests and conditions. All right, so now we're actually just going to talk about the pests themselves. Oh, Jess actually has killed a rat with her hands. Okay, so vertebrates. Okay, so we're talking about rats, also gophers, also bunnies, also deer and coyotes. Not that coyotes go in and eat your plants, but actually coyotes are your friends because they're going to eat all these other guys. So cats, domestic cats. I have to do a little public service announcement thing here. Please, if you have a domestic cat, as I do, and having come from a family with like 18 cats that were all free roaming, I'm very, very adamant about talking to my past me through this to all of you. If you have cats, please keep them indoors. Don't ever let them be free roaming. Domestic cats are not indigenous to this land at all. And they're the top killers of our biodiversity in the form of birds and lizards and other animals. So they are leading the extinction trajectory for bird species because we, number one, have so many of them and we don't keep them inside. So again, like I said, I'm not saying this as a judgy person because my family was this person. I'm literally talking to me here. I have 3 cats at this point, and they're all indoors. When they're outdoors, it's because I put them out. I'm watching them for like 5 minutes, and then we're putting them right back in. Or you can create these really cool catios, like little cat condos outside, so they can get some sun and feel like they're outdoors and be outdoors, but without the danger of them killing birds, killing other animals and lizards and such. So the free roaming cat concept really has to get kind of brought in and curtailed if we want to protect our biodiversity. So that is considered a vertebrate pest in this context. I would even characterize them as an invasive species. So that is not only that they're just pests, like gophers are native, they're just pests, but cats are an invasive species that are also pests and also delightful. But make sure you keep them in the context where they make sense, which is that they are a domesticated animal for companionship with humans and enrich their environment in every way that you can that doesn't involve them becoming a danger to other animals. All right, so gophers, cats, skunks, possums may live in your garden. Outdoor cats, no good. And so gophers, think about why we have these issues. A lot of why we have these issues is how many walls and fences and ways that we've created an inhospitable environment for natural kind of pest managers, which are the coyotes, which are the bobcats. Bobcats are very elusive, very secretive, very shy. So we don't have, like, our human cities are so noisy and dangerous and not hospitable to them at all. So even though they would naturally eat, you know, gophers and other animals, they're never going to visit anymore because we created an environment that doesn't work for them. Coyotes, we have created an environment that works for them because they're really adaptable and they can kind of live in our cities. However, we've created physical barriers. So when we talked about mechanical means of creating barriers, we've inadvertently created these mechanical means of barriers of the animals that will take care of our problem for us, which are obviously this inundation of bunnies or gophers and all of these other animals. So you might have to just resort to cages, gopher baskets, gopher netting. Voleking, VOLEKING is a good brand of these kind of gopher nettings. Emily nodding her head. Jack introduced that to me. So, so insect pests, again, know your pest or know your insect. They're not all pests. In fact, so many species in California, there's 1,600 species of native bees. About 700 or so are in LA County. And so there's so much insect variety. That's just bees. We have pollinating flies. We have pollinating wasps. We have parasitic wasps that are incredible pest managers. Wasps are, or somebody described, bees are wasps who have forgotten how to hunt. And so imagine wasps are bees that also know how to hunt, which is awesome. So these are incredible creatures. And most of them are things that you want in your yard. So sometimes you see damage, something that's quote unquote damage that isn't actually damage. It's just evidence that your yard is supporting all sorts of forms of insect life. And so for instance, this image is of Western redbud leaves. The Eastern redbud leaves are kind of similar and we'll use that as well. But the Western redbuds are native redbud. And so the leafcutter bee will take these little kind of circles out of these leaves, and they will line their nests inside a cavity. And they will line these nests, and in each little chamber, they'll lay an egg, and they will leave enough kind of like pollen mass or something like that for the larva to eat, and then it reemerges, and that's how they reproduce. So this is part of their nesting. So this, when you see this evidence, it's not like, oh no, something's eating my leaves. It's like, oh yay, my yard is habitat. This is a wonderful thing. All right, I'm just gonna look at the chat because I just saw like 11 new things. Emily said Voleking should sponsor them. Yes. Oh, it's all about cats. Let's see, cat condos are amazing. Yes. Jingle collars. That's a step. If you literally can't keep a cat indoors, there are some scenarios where, you know, it's not your cat or whatever it is, but oh, an accidental mouse death by a pitchfork in the compost pile. I had a dead rat in my compost pile, and I thought I was grabbing a piece of rope or a piece of like cord, and it was actually the rat's tail. And I pulled the rat out, and it was like very dead. I put that on my Instagram, so you can look up Wilder Gardens on Instagram. You can see that. Let's see. Building warehouses for cats. It's tricky. I mean, it's not an easy solution. All right. Yes, unfortunately, Alexis says he has a wildlife camera on the Westwood Greenway, and most of the sightings are domestic cats. So that's a real problem. And the feeding of the cats and creating these outdoor cat colonies is not a good solution. Trap, neuter, release is still not a good solution. It's better than not doing that, because then they're not going to reproduce, but they're still there. So it's a tricky situation. But the insects, in this scenario, this is just very good evidence. And luckily the insects don't get damaged by cats for the most part. Argentine ants. So these are problems. The Argentine ant is an invasive ant. We do have native ants, but the ones that you're going to see the most often, both in your home and in your garden, are these invasive Argentine ants. They like to harvest and move around other pests, and they kind of harvest the honeydew, it's called, off of the aphids, which is like this sweet kind of sticky substance. So they like that. They will colonize the root systems of plants and kind of weaken them, and they're just generally kind of pesky. They're not ideal in nurseries, so they'll do that. Also, they'll just go into the nursery pot, kind of colonize a pot, and sometimes lead to the decline of the plant itself. Unfortunately for Argentine ants and or unfortunately for us, there is no natural predator of Argentine ants the way that there are so many natural predators for aphids. So in the case of aphids, I say let it be and wait for the natural enemies to show up. In the case of Argentine ants, they have one natural enemy, and they're termites. Termites don't like ants, and ants don't like termites. So if they're in the same place, they fight. So like the ants will rip the wings off of the termites. It's this really like traumatic thing. But nobody wants to release a horde of termites onto ants, or vice versa. Nobody says, I have a termite problem, and like, oh yeah, let's just release this infestation of ants in your house and they'll take care of it for you. Both are pests. And so this is one scenario where getting something from, I'll say, over the counter kind of a thing is useful. And so Terro, Terro, is a brand you can buy at any garden store, Home Depot, Amazon. And it just, I think it's like one of those borax solutions that are kind of sweet, that attract the ants. They take it back to their colony, they share it, they all start to die. But in the meantime, they're going to keep going back and forth to this. It is a poison, but it's relatively like mild compared to other poisons. It's just like, again, I think it's like a sweet, sugary borax solution. You can make it yourself. You can do home solutions as well to get rid of Argentine ants. So again, aphids, we're back to aphids. They're fantastic. They're fantastic because you don't have to do much for them, about them. And so they will kind of end up on the stems. They like tender parts of the plants. You will find them on new sprouts of things in early spring. So as things are kind of like emerging in the springtime, that's like the juiciest parts of the plant. So you'll start to see a little bit of deformed leaves. Almost always, not every single time, but almost always the plant grows out of it without you doing anything. And I will find a picture before we're out of the evidence that you have the parasitoid wasps. And so what the wasps do is they come to the aphid, they lay their egg inside the aphid body. The egg hatches inside the body and eats the aphid from the inside out, and then exits out the cavity. And then you just have this like shell of an aphid left over. And so you'll end up with this plant. It was covered in aphids, like you see in this picture, and then it's just covered in these shells with little holes in them. They're these kind of like bronzy, beige kind of shells that are left over, or aphid mummies, they're sometimes called. And that's how you know you have this amazing kind of natural pest predator in the vicinity. And so had you sprayed the plant, maybe you were killing the larva that was eating the aphid on the inside out, and then you reduce the population of those wasps. And so you end up continuously having this aphid problem year after year because you're not allowing that reproductive process to happen with the wasps. So aphids are, again, like, don't do anything about them for the most part. Scale has these bumpy, hard-shelled insects. They're not, it's like these guys here. So they look like barnacles, almost, actually. And so they're pretty stationary, but they can be problematic. If it's a very small amount, I probably wouldn't do anything about them. But if there's quite a number of them, what you might consider doing is brushing them off with like a toothbrush, with some rubbing alcohol or something, actually just kind of destroying it. Once you break that shell, it's very hard for them to kind of keep surviving. And so you want to make sure you've kind of broken that shell and expose them. But adults can be hard to remove, but you want to just, you have to, that's a manual thing. Sometimes the sprays could probably do it, but you have to kind of dislodge them a little bit. So thrips, very small, you won't really see them, but you will see the evidence on some plants. Sucking insect, kind of like, an aphid's a sucking insect, but these are extra small and they'll just go on the leaf. And so you'll see some kind of deformation and on the leaf. Usually not a big, fatal issue to have it. Conceivably a neem oil or something like that could get rid of them, but again, you'd be getting rid of other things accidentally as well. So again, I've never had a thrips problem where there's just so many that I care about it at all. So if you have some scenario where it's like really devastating your plants, you can look on the UCIPM website to see what to do about it. But it's rare that you're gonna have like a life or death scenario with this insect. Mealybugs. Mealybugs are kind of this like fuzzy white, almost like little moldy, cottony insects. They're really soft bodied, so you can crush them very easily. The other thing to keep in mind that soapy water with dish soapy water kills insects. It's an insecticidal thing. So it will kill the good guys too. But for those of you who are like where it's something targeted and you want to kill an insect, you could just mix your Dawn dish soap with water and spray it on a plant. That's a technically non-toxic insecticide that you can use. That also kills ants and such. So depending on how strong the dilution is, the plants are usually not affected by it, especially if you kind of rinse them out afterwards. But if it's too much soap, you can obviously hurt the plant. So bark beetles are not really anything that you can do anything about, unfortunately. I'd like to say that you can do something in your garden to prevent them. In the most part, this is a forestry issue, a little bit more of those big, larger land, forest service type of an issue, a little bit less in the residential garden, though you will see beetles and issues in residential trees as well. Depending on the type of beetle. So we have the invasive shot hole borer here. We have the bark beetle here. I think bark beetles, number one, go for bark, but number two, go for kind of drought stressed trees, whereas the invasive shot hole borer actually likes well-watered trees. And so these guys will go into the water carrying parts of the trees, and they will create these little galleries. And so that's an image on the bottom left. They'll create these galleries where they farm fusarium, which is a type of fungus that they have this like long-standing millions of years. It's like a primitive, very, very, very old. I think they've been around just like for millions of years. And they have this fusarium in their mouths, and they have this relationship with fusarium, this fungus. And so they create these galleries inside the tree, and they kind of like spit the fusarium on the walls of the galleries, and they farm this fusarium inside the tree. So the tree doesn't die because there's galleries, and it doesn't die because there's a hole inside it. It dies because it gets a secondary fungal infection with the fusarium. And so it's usually like the secondary fungal infections that kill the trees. And so the way that you can tell if you have that bark beetle, and here's some images, obviously, of trees that have these holes in them and this kind of seeping, weeping sap. The sap is their attempt to, protect themselves and isolate themselves from the injury. And so they actually found the trees like with the most sap are actually trying, doing a little bit of a better job resisting the disease or the beetle and the secondary infection. The test for, because lots of beetles will leave holes in trees, the way to know that it's the actual shot hole borer is the hole is the exact size of the tip of a medium point regular like ballpoint pen. So if you put that right up to the hole and it's the exact size, then it's this particular beetle over other types of beetles, because there'll be holes in trees that are not the invasive shot hole borer, and so they're just all different sizes. But I think it's like medium point ballpoint pen. Put it right up to the hole. If it's the exact size, then you know that you have the invasive shotwell borer. And they tend to go for the riparian species like sycamores, like box elders, but they have a whole array of hosts that include non-native species as well. And pretty much every expert that I've ever heard speak on the invasive shotwell borer has said that the list of host plants or host trees for the shotwell borer should not be treated as a do not plant list. So they emphasize every time they do like a presentation on this subject that we should still be planting these host trees, that just because a sycamore is a host plant doesn't mean we never plant sycamores anymore, or white alder doesn't mean we never plant white alders anymore. It's just that we have to be more attentive, and we need to report it if we do suspect that there's an issue. Robert says there are 600 different species of bark beetles, which is a whole lot. Charles asks, says, in my understanding and experience, in the majority of cases, insects will rarely harvest more than 10 to 15% of an established, just made a big noise, of an established plant. Do you agree? Generally speaking, yes. It's the biggest danger comes with young baby plants, or recently planted plants, that the insect problem can be overwhelming for the plant. For most established gardens, it's very rare that an insect will denude the whole thing. The one exception, not one exception, but in my observation, I've had a very hard time with shrubby lupines. So Lupinus albifrons, for instance, I've planted, which is silverbush lupine. I've done it on 2 occasions where a particular species of moth lays the eggs and the caterpillars just decimate the entire plant till it's dead. So in that scenario, I would actually be manually removing the caterpillars. And they would do that a lot at the nursery at Theodore Payne as well. So, you know, caterpillars are food for baby birds. They're so essential in the food chain, but for a young plant that's still really tiny and hasn't had a lot of root system, and doesn't have a lot of mass on top either, it's just way too much of a overwhelming amount of eating the plant. It did actually kill it on 2 separate occasions. So it's rare. But again, I'm talking about a small plant. Established, mature plant can probably take it. All right. I thought that native plants are pest exempt. No, they are not pest exempt, but they are so beneficial to a much wider array of species and plants that they end up attracting way more beneficial insects than most non-native plants. And therefore, once they've attracted the natural pest managers, the pest issues are kept in check naturally without you having to intervene. So that's the thing. They're majorly supportive of insect life, including larger number of pest beneficial insects. Can a silo insecticide be applied to an infected tree? I would like to know what a silo insecticide is to answer that question. Do I cut down the tree? It just depends on, if we're talking about the invasive shotwell borer, I would contact, gosh, I don't remember their names. Keith Escalon, I think, and there was another gentleman, where you kind of report it, and they can either come and see and verify that you have that issue. If it is, you're sure that you have that issue. One of the things that unfortunately
I don't understand. Review 12-month maintenance calendar and workbook. Where's the 12-month maintenance calendar?
It's probably in there.
Let's get that muted. All right. Okay, so the shotwell borer usually infects one tree severely, and then after that disperses to a lot of different trees. So if you have only one infected tree and everything's untouched, it might actually even be beneficial to remove and destroy that one tree before they do this thing where they kind of like just disperse to a million other trees. But you'd have to do a survey of the other trees in the area to see that they haven't infected those yet, because you don't necessarily want to remove every single tree. And there have been scenarios where the trees are isolating. Some of the trees are kind of like compartmentalizing themselves to isolate the problem and still survive. So you're gonna see some of the trees have a defense mechanism, but I can't really speak with major authority on this, since I'm not a scientist dedicated to it. Rust is a catch-all term for a large group of fungi that are really, really annoying and frustrating. They will create this rusty fungus that is on the leaves of the plants. In this case, it looks almost like it's on grass. But I had a big rust issue with golden currant, which is Ribes aureum. I planted it in a lot of shade and it got covered in rust. And then I killed it. I mean, I just, removed it. And then I decided to plant a new one in a place with more sun. And that one did not get rust. So whether that plant had rust potentially in its tiny, tiny amount that I didn't see from a nursery that proliferated, or whether I placed it in too much of an unfavorable condition, then once I gave it more sunlight, more airflow, it thrived. It's unclear. So again, that's a cultural change that I did. I changed the plant placement for that species and observed the result. Rust is sometimes something you can treat with fungicides. I have not done that thus far. I haven't seen it enough times where it's warranted that. Again, I only killed the one plant. The funny thing about that is this orange rust that's all over the plants is weirdly harvested by honeybees. I kept seeing honeybees around it, like collecting it on their legs like pollen. And I found out that that's an actual thing that they do. And I can't quite tell if it's because they're stupid and they don't know it's not pollen, or that it actually provides some weird form of nutrition to them that is, not quite researched yet. So it was very strange. But conceivably they could be spreading it too. So that was not a good thing that I wanted to necessarily see. All right. So this one is a pretty significant one, and is one that you should be familiar with regards to native plants. For those of you who came to the Tree People workshop, we talked a little bit about Phytophthora. Waterborne diseases like Phytophthora. Phytophthora is a water mold, it's called. It's not quite a fungus, but it's considered a water mold or oomycete or something like that. And so it is a pathogen that causes root rot, crown rot in plants. And so Phytophthora in Greek literally means plant destroyer. And so it's just a pathogen that proliferates in conditions where the soils are waterlogged, and particularly if it's like hot waterlogged soil, that's really not an ideal situation for native plants. So your risk for Phytophthora, if you remember that pathogen triangle, if you have a susceptible host, meaning a plant that's susceptible to root rot, say like this sticky monkey flower here, or a manzanita, or some of the other, like a ceanothus, you have the host. The pathogen is there. Maybe it came in the pot from the nursery. Maybe it was already kind of present in your soil. And then you have the condition where you have highly waterlogged soil. Maybe you have heavy clay soil and you overwatered during the summertime. That is your kind of three conditions that would have created this disease that you see on the right. So this is a dead monkey flower that that was intentionally inoculated with Phytophthora tentaculata. So that one was given it, so you can see the disease issue there. So they favor wet conditions with poor drainage. So if you have clay, heavy clay, slow draining soil, that's a higher risk. Your need to reduce your watering to minimal levels in the summer after the plants are established, that need is much higher in your garden than would be in a really sandy soil, well-draining garden. So that's the favorable disease environment for them. So just keep that in mind. You want to make sure that you're reducing your water use over time, and definitely reducing the summer water after the plants are established. In the first year, you're going to have to water them through the first summer. But again, they shouldn't be waterlogged. It should still be deep water, dry down period, deep water, dry down period. Every time you give it that dry down period, it kind of cuts that environment, that favorable environment out of the picture, because they don't want to be dried out. They do travel through and proliferate in continuously wet conditions. So powdery mildew, this one's very common. This happens a lot, even on just veggie plants in your garden, in your vegetable garden. But powdery mildew is something that you will often see as a seasonal problem, and is less of a big deal issue, because it often resolves itself. Sometimes it's a big deal issue, but for the most part, you will see this a lot on salvias, especially Salvia spathacia, which is the hummingbird sage. I have not seen Salvia spathacia not have mildew when it's planted in the shade. And so Salvia spathacia is one of those species that we say is very shade tolerant, but this is one of those things that afflicts it every time it's planted in more shade. When it's planted in more sunlight, I don't really see this issue. Some of our sages, some of the purple sages, for instance, and maybe even Salvia spathacia, in the springtime, as it transitions from winter to spring, that's when they'll get a little bit of powdery mildew, and then by summer it goes away. So it's just like a couple months, you know, it might have some spotting of this mildew, and then once it's hot and dry and the leaves aren't staying really kind of wet, the ground moisture is drier, everything's kind of less humid, it'll go away on its own. So it's a seasonal issue more so than a big kind of life or death scenario. And it's a cultural issue in the sense that if you're doing too much overhead watering, meaning like you're doing it daily for some reason, or the leaves are staying wet overnight because you're doing the watering at night and it's staying wet overnight instead of doing it in the morning where it has a chance to dry off during the day. Or if you planted something in too much shade, that's when this kind of issue comes around. So it's something that's usually avoidable culturally, or something that you just kind of have to wait through seasonally. So somebody said they thought that hummingbird sage. Oh, yay. Somebody put in Akif Escalen's contact information if you have a reporting or you want to look at research on the shotwell borer. Somebody said that they thought hummingbird sage prefers some shade. Is it full shade that's an issue? Yes, full shade is the issue. It does like some shade. On the coast, it would like to be in full sun, I think. And I think that it can take full sun in most other scenarios if you're okay with them going partially dormant. But if you're inland, half day of shade and half day of sun is a really nice compromise. So powdery mildew can harm plants if it doesn't go away on its own, or it can just make them look ugly and flower less. And it's usually a big issue with crops. It can really stunt the ability for the crops to grow and fruit. And certain different types of mildews can affect like grape leaves, for instance, and reduce the grape harvest and things like that. So mildew is kind of an issue. One remedy that's kind of just like a home kitchen remedy is using diluted milk. You can also use, I don't know if you can use like whey or something like that, but generally just get your milk, that your usual kind of, hopefully, I don't know if full fat or non-fat matters, but take your milk and dilute it. You can Google it, there's different ratios, but I usually do like 1/4 milk and 3/4 water, and you spray the leaves, but the leaves have to be, after you spray, they have to be in full contact with the sun. So it has to be on a sunny, dry day, not overcast, not not at night. So it has to be on a kind of sunny day. You spray all the leaves with this diluted milk, and something about either the enzymes in the milk and their reaction to the sunlight kills the mildew fungus on the leaves. So I've actually had some pretty good success with that. But the trick that I've found is that powdery mildew is a seasonal issue often, and the time of year when it happens isn't always sunny for you to be able to do that. So you can end up, in winter and early spring, lots of overcast days, and that's what creates this powdery mildew issue. And then you want to go out with your diluted milk, and it's not sunny. The leaves are not going to get that direct, unfiltered sunlight to be able to do this. So unless it's happening at a time of day, you can do it every 10 days, pretty consistently, with the sun as a guaranteed piece of it, it can be less effective. So that's the challenge. All right. So these IPM principles and practices are combined to create IPM programs. 6 major components are common to all of the programs. So pest identification. Remember what a pest legitimately is. That's something to keep in mind, and not to jump to conclusions about what a pest might be. Monitoring and assessment of the numbers and damage. So checking plants regularly to spot problems before they get out of hand is something to do, but also not jumping the gun about trying to do something about it. Sometimes waiting it out is the best rule of thumb. So you want to make sure that you give a chance for the plants to either recover on their own or for the natural pest predators to come in. But monitoring and being aware of timelines and keeping a record is something that's important. It might be something that you might want to incorporate into your work, so that you can report to clients. But at the same time, don't alarm your clients, because they can sometimes freak out about pests when they don't need to. Guidelines for when management action is needed. Be slow to act, take good notes with photos. Also note whether certain combinations of natives can reduce overabundance of certain insects. Please remember, we already talked about this, but remember that milkweed attracts aphids, caterpillars as well. We want the caterpillars. The whole point of milkweed is to support the monarch butterfly population. And so the whole concept of this is a host plant for a butterfly. The butterfly sees it, lays the egg, their larva eats it. That's what it means by it's a host plant. It means their larvae, meaning the caterpillars, require that plant in order to survive. So they are attracted to that specific plant. The caterpillars get nice and fat. Then they go off and form a chrysalis somewhere, and then they turn into a butterfly. And then we've created that whole cycle. And so in the case of milkweed, which is misspelled, I believe, they will do this whole process with their caterpillars. They will also attract aphids, which then in turn attract all sorts of other predators and beneficial insects. So don't do anything about it, frankly. Preventing pest problems is a good idea. Spacing your natives and mulching in between is generally a good thing, but good garden culture is definitely good. By spacing your natives, part of the reason for that is sometimes people overcrowd their plants, and then all that congested foliage can sometimes get mildewy or create some issues with foliar diseases and such. So you want to make sure that sunlight, airflow, those things are really, really critical to maintaining health. So the plant's ability to get ample airflow is important, and also to receive that kind of sunlight. Sunlight is a really good disinfectant, believe it or not. And so getting some good sunlight on a plant that likes the sun, obviously, is important. So using a combination of management tools is usually more effective than just using one. So if you can change something about your garden culture, plus have a scenario where the natural biological control comes in, and maybe you're doing something physical or mechanical, you're going to be more effective than if you just do one or the other. And some of these things, again, are passive. They're going to happen on their own, like the biological control might happen just because beneficial insects in the neighborhood get a wind of your garden and start to take care of the issue for you. And then you want to assess, obviously, the effect of their pest management to see if it's successful. Have you implemented this strategy and you're starting to see a reduction or not? Are you implementing this strategy, but you've also damaged the population of butterflies in the area? You want to make sure that the pest issue that you're trying to control doesn't have unintended consequences for other life. All right. So services that you may offer on a fee basis. Spring weed cleanup. So one of the hardest times of the year for weeding, you'll find that weeding is largely seasonal. Winter and spring are your toughest weed seasons. Fall, actually summer is your kind of like technical brush clearance time that you're required to do certain types of brush clearance depending on where you are. But the spring and winter is when you want to tackle weeds in order to have them not come back the next year. So that's usually when they're gonna, by spring they're flowering, and by summer they've set their seeds. So you want to tackle that earlier, and that might be something that you do on an extra basis, meaning it requires a level of additional hours from you, and so you can do that as like an additional add-on. So some resources for you to look into is that IPM website and this diagnostic tool on the IPM website. So I'm going to click it, and you guys are going to put in the chat whether you see it or not, or if this did not go to the link and you can't see it. So if it's still on that page and it's not on the thing that says, welcome to UC IPM's plant problem diagnostic tool, let me know. You're still on the slide. Okay, then I'm going to stop the share, and then I'm going to open it up for you separately. Okay, now share. Okay, so now you can see this. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, so now we're on the diagnostic tool website. On the left, now I'm going to use an example of something that I noticed in my yard. I haven't done anything about it, but it was something that was bothering me, and I was curious what it was. So on the left, you're going to see plant types. Click on that. My issue was on a toyon shrub. So obviously it's not a flower, it's not a fruit, it's not a vegetable, it's just in the trees and shrubs category. So I just clicked on trees and shrubs, there it is. Plant names. Now this is pretty general. It doesn't, some of it's very species specific and some of it's a little bit more general. So like something, I'll just say sages or salvias. So in the case of what I want toyon. And that actually does have, there it is. So now I'm going to add to list. All right, so now I just did trees and shrubs as a toyon. The plant parts that I'm concerned about has to do with the leaves. So the leaves have this weird discoloration and stippling, and are kind of duller, and there's also some weird activity on the underside. So then I'm going to try to describe that damage. So the leaves are curled, cupped, folded, rolled, or twisted. No, that's not what's happening. They're defoliated or skeletonized. No. Deformed or distorted. No. Discolored. Yeah. Necrosis, which is like dying parts of the leaves, or chlorosis when that turns kind of yellowed. Maybe that might be something, but you can put multiple things here. So leaves dropping, clinging, no. Galls, rough, holes, no. Ragged, tatters, specks or flecks and stippled. That describes what I was seeing. And maybe also, oops, let's do that. Spots, blotches, that's kind of also relevant too. So what it's going to do is it's going to give me all the options of what's affecting my plant based on narrowing it down to these kinds of effects and also the actual species. And so I'm going to look at things that toyon are susceptible to that do this thing. So then you're going to view your results. All right, so it could be collar, foot, root, and crown rot, but that's not what's happening to my plant. The plant is really robust and is healthy and is fine. It's just these leaves are kind of discolored. So I don't think that's right. Entosporium leaf spot. And there should be like photos that are not opening up. So unfortunately the photos aren't opening. So when I went through this whole thing, so you can see it says thrips. So we talked about that as an insect, white flies, scales. When I went through the whole thing and investigated on my plant further, I found out that I had this, which are these are lace bugs. And again, unfortunately, this is not working. But let me maybe click on it and it might open. Okay, so these are adult lace bugs, and they look like little papery, weird things. And they like just kind of like dance on the underside of the leaves. When I pick it up, I see a few of these and I wonder what the heck are these. So these are lace bugs, and they are, I think, like kind of sucking at the leaves a little bit and making them discolored. It's not fatal. It's just unsightly. But that was my, answer to my question is what's happening to my plant. And then I was able to narrow it down to this thing. You can shoot these with, strong stream of water and kind of dislodge them and disrupt them. You can clean up the leaf litter. So it will have little examples of, or samples of how to manage it. You can clean up the leaf litter underneath and kind of, again, disrupt their reproductive cycle, because sometimes that they're reproducing in the leaf litter, etc. So that's how you can do that. You can also just search in general. So I'm going to search wasp. I know that it's called it's like aphidus wasp, natural pest, and that's it. Aphidius, natural enemies gallery. Okay, so this is what I was talking about, a mummified aphid. This is the wasp. There it is laying an egg inside an aphid. This is what you will see on the other side of your plants if you have had this wasp come through and take care of a bunch of aphids for you. So this is a close-up of a dead shell of an aphid. And when they're clustered like this, they almost look like a bug or a beetle, but they're already dead. And it's just a beautiful sign of this having been taken care of for you. So just recently, David Newsom of the Wild Yards Project, for those of you who are not familiar or don't follow him on Instagram, I would follow him. Wild Yards Project is a nonprofit he started to kind of promote the concept of these habitat gardens in lieu of conventional lawns, and he does a lot of really great kind of photo documentation of the things that he's working on. And just today in his Instagram story, he posted a picture of an Encelia californica, which was the coast bush sunflower, and the base of it just covered in these aphid mummies, which again is just shows you that he had this parasitoid wasp that came in and took care of all the pests for him, and it's just a beautiful example of natural pest management. So it's very, very cool to see. And you can look up more natural enemies. Let's see, aphid flies, aphid midge, assassin bugs. Like it's literally brown lacewings. Just tons of syrphid flies are fantastic. So these are called flower flies or syrphid flies or hover flies. This is an image of their larva. It looks like a little caterpillar. You would look at it, think it was a little caterpillar, but all they do is just munch on aphids all day long. And so this fly, and there's lots of different kinds, so they look a little different depending on the fly. They kind of hover around. They do this kind of like, instead of flying like this, they do this kind of thing. So you've likely seen them because of how they fly, and they look for plants with aphids. So when I grow plants out in a nursery and I know this group of sages is covered in aphids, you will see that the hoverflies just hovering all over the aphids, over my group of sages, for instance, and then just laying eggs, laying eggs, laying eggs, laying eggs, laying eggs. And then within a couple months, the aphid problem's gone because this wonderful creature right here just ate them all. So this is a really great website for you to just kind of cruise around and take a look at. This is the pupa of a syrphid fly, so that's often stuck to the plant. So you look at it and be like, oh, that's a beetle. It's not a beetle, that's the pupa of the syrphid fly. So don't think that's a pest. So a lot of times we think things are pests that are not pests, including ladybug larvae. And I don't know if that's on here. Lady. Oh, 7-spotted lady beetle. So most people think this is a bad guy. This is a ladybug baby. So that's our ladybug mature. That's our ladybug mature. And that's our baby. He's an ugly baby, but he's incredibly good at eating aphids. So when you see this black, spiky looking beetle crawling all over your plants, including your milkweed, know that it's eating all your aphids and that it's going to become this ladybug. So just start to cruise around, especially this natural enemies gallery, and get a feel for what these insects look like at different life stages, because you will get thrilled. And it's one of the most exciting things. It's like you've discovered another dimension of reality or some other planet, but on a micro scale in the context of your yard, or a landscape or what have you. So when you start to see those relationships and you start to see those animals starting to come and visit, it's so exciting. And so I really encourage you to get familiar with them so that you start to identify them actually in the field. All right, so I'm going to stop that share and go back to the PowerPoint. So those are your resources. That's listed in your student handbook. So there's an example. Put in the chat what you think this is. What disease is this? Powdery mildew, great. Yes. So this is powdery mildew on a sage, specifically probably like bee's bliss sage or one of those purple sage hybrids. This is a ground cover. The ground covers sometimes get it because they're kind of closer to the ground. There's a little less airflow when they're like stuck on the ground, and if it's really moist, they sometimes get it. Mine used to get it every year in the early spring, but then it was gone by summer and I just never did anything about it. It's fine. Again, I don't think it's something that you need to jump to doing something about it every time. And if you can do the little diluted milk, doesn't smell good, I will say, like milk drying on plants with the sun baking, it doesn't smell great, but it is better than doing something else potentially chemical. Manzanita leaf gall aphid. So this is on the ends of the manzanita leaves, you'll sometimes see this little kind of bulge, and it's usually red. Sometimes it just stays green or yellow, but a gall or a leaf gall is an insect will kind of manipulate the leaf or modify the leaf and create this nest sort of for itself, where it does its kind of reproductive cycle within the leaf tissue, and it deforms this leaf tissue in this way. And so it's really not a problem. You'll see it on nursery plants, you'll see it in your garden. It's really rarely, if ever, causes significant harm to the plant. So just leave it alone. It's not a problem. But just so you can see it and not wonder what's happening to my plant. It's a gall. And so oaks will create galls. So if you've ever been around lots of oak trees, looks like almost little apples in the tree. So it's like a little round ball. And again, that's where an insect has modified the tissue to create a home for itself, where it carries out its reproductive cycle, and then the gall usually falls off, but it doesn't harm the tree, doesn't harm the plant. So your homework assignment is to review the 12-month calendar in the workbook. That's page 139. So let me just go there. Where is that? I don't see it page 139. I see it page 131. 139. It's the second to last page of your workbook. Right there. So this is a native plant maintenance guide by month that kind of gives you an idea of month to month what kinds of things that you should be potentially doing in a garden or in a landscape, depending on the season or the need. And so note the discrepancies that may occur or that you've experienced with regards to disease or insects, and note IPM strategies to regain garden aesthetic and or health. So that's one option for your homework. Or, and I think this one's way more fun, use the UC-ANR IPM website and or diagnostic tool to investigate a pest issue you are seeing in the garden and note IPM strategies to manage it. So I think that's a little bit more of a targeted question that is a little more clear and more engaging, because it involves you going out into a space and looking for pests and or disease issues that you suspect. So that one's kind of if you can hear my tone, that I would rather see those in my inbox because that's more fun for me. You know, you can do either one. However, I think it would be really fun for you guys to familiarize yourself with the IPM website and to go out there and take some photos of some issues you might be seeing. So it might be, again, plant is wilting and looks like, you know, maybe it's in a really overwatered spot and you're suspecting Phytophthora. Maybe it's a plant covered in aphids. Maybe it's a plant that has powdery mildew. Maybe it's a plant that's getting eaten by too many caterpillars, you think perhaps, or is getting eaten by bunnies and you've tried to cage it, but it's not getting caged. And so note these strategies from the website that they recommend, and then maybe even suggest what you're going to do about it, or if you're not going to do something about it, tell me why. And so so that's your homework assignment. And if you have any question, it is a fun homework assignment, yes. If you have any questions about it, feel free to let me know. You have until next Tuesday to do this, so you have a nice weekend to go out and to start investigating. Again, this can be in your own native garden or a client's garden or a public garden, or you can go to a botanical garden, maybe the Theodore Payne garden or something like that to start to look for these things. Let's see. Next question. Not next question. Next slide is our final slide. And that's it for today, guys. Hooray. I think we made it in the time, right? We're not, 5 minutes. Excellent.